We're celebrating 250 episodes. Listen in for the lessons I've learned on this episode of the Speaking Your Brand podcast. More and more women are making an impact by starting businesses, running for office, and speaking up for what matters. With my background as a TV political analyst, entrepreneur, and speaker, I interview and coach purpose-driven women to shape their brands, grow their companies, and become recognized as influencers in their field. This is Speaking Your Brand, your place to learn how to persuasively communicate your message to your audience. Hi and welcome. I'm your host, Carol Cox. We are celebrating 250 episodes of the Speaking Your Brand podcast. So I wanted to take this opportunity to share with you lessons I've learned after hosting and creating 250 episodes, as well as what's coming next for the podcast. And these insights and takeaways will be useful to you whether you currently host your own podcast, are thinking of launching your own podcast, and or if you guest on other people's podcasts. I really want to dig into what makes podcasting unique and how it's different from video and from writing. And really, I love podcasting. I've loved it since I first started listening to podcasts. This was back in around 2009, 2010. I had an iPod back then, so I didn't even have an iPhone, an iPod, and I would connect the iPod to my laptop and transfer the podcast that I wanted to listen to from the laptop to the iPod. And then I had a special FM to iPod transmitter in my car. I know these are like the old days, right? Like 8-track cassette tapes. And so that I would put the iPod in my car so I could listen to podcasts when I was driving. I mean, I was really dedicated. Obviously, we've come a long way with podcasting. It has really boomed over the past 5 years. And so I really want to talk about what makes podcasting unique because this will be helpful to you again as a podcast host as well as a podcast guest. This is the first episode we're doing in a new series that I'm calling The Medium is the Message. You may recognize this phrase. It's from a media theorist named Marshall McLuhan, who wrote about this idea around media and technology in the 1950s and 1960s. And what he proposed was that it was the media themselves, so the medium that is being used, not the content. So it doesn't really matter what the content is. It doesn't matter if the content is, what we would call good or bad, if the content is funny or if the content is sad or if the content provokes outrage. It didn't really matter what the content was of the media. What mattered was the medium itself. And the medium is what affects society and affects changes in politics, in democracy, in religion, in capitalism, all of these different things that have come into our modern world over the past couple hundred years, really starting with the printing press, of course, back in the 1500s, and then thinking into the 20th century with radio, television, and of course, the internet and social media. And what Marshall McLuhan really looked at was he saw that it was the technology itself, the medium, the channel that was shaping our social interactions, was shaping our habits, and was really changing how we interacted with the world. So here's an example that he gave as far as how the medium is the message and how the medium really impacts how the person on the other end, whether it's the viewer, the reader, the listener, the consumer, and so on, interacts with that particular medium. So he gave this example that a passage in a book could be reread at will. So if you're reading a book, and let's assume it's a print book, because again, he was writing in the 1950s and 1960s. Let's imagine it was a print book. You're reading it. You can dog-ear it. You can put a little tab in it. You can put a bookmark in it. You can highlight it. You can make notes in it. You can put a page, write down the page number and come back to it. But he said a movie would have to be screened again in its entirety to study any individual part of it. And that was very much the case in the 1950s and 1960s. Obviously, you probably weren't going to screen a movie theater in your own home unless you were a movie executive. So if you wanted to find one particular scene in a movie, you would have to go to a movie theater and watch the whole thing over again. But that's not the case anymore. The medium of YouTube, of course, the internet, and then be able to host videos on and then be able to stream videos. But with a channel like YouTube, people put clips and scenes of movies and TV shows all over YouTube all of the time. So now you can go find a particular clip or scene from a movie at will, just like you can find a particular passage in a book. So this is where the medium really changes how we interact with it. And so what got me thinking about this, and if you're interested in reading more Marshall McLuhan, it is rather dense and rather academic. I honestly don't recommend it for reading, but I just wanted to kind of give you the sense of what it means that the medium is the message. So the medium really dictates how we interact with it. And what got me thinking about this was that as entrepreneurs, as marketers, as content creators, we're told to kind of repurpose our content. So we just kind of copy paste content from one platform, one medium to the next. So whether it's a podcast and then a YouTube video and then LinkedIn and then Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and emails and blogs. And so, yes, I understand the premise behind repurposing content because our content, especially if it's really good and really valuable, we want people to be able to consume it in different places. But it doesn't really work that well when we do this, when we literally just kind of copy paste and assume it's going to work the same on every platform, because every platform, every channel, every medium is different. It wants different things, and the audience interacts with that medium differently. And that's really dictated by the medium. It's not dictated so much by the piece of content that you're putting on there. And I think about the algorithms on social media, especially because most of us are trying to increase our audience on social media, increase our following, increase our engagement so that more people know about the work that we do and ultimately then can decide if they would want to work with us. And then think about Instagram. And when Instagram Reels came out, and sometime probably, I don't know, in the past year, Instagram was really pushing Reels. And I don't know how this happened, if it was a choice by Instagram or if some Instagram influencer started this. But people started dancing and pointing kind of up in the reel and pointing at words or dancing. And those types of videos tended to get picked up more by the algorithm. So then more people started doing it. Now, that doesn't really lend itself much to my personality to dance and to point at the screen. If it does for you, fantastic. Because this is the point of the series, is to find out what feels authentic and genuine to you. So I'm not going to do Instagram Reels where I'm dancing and pointing because it doesn't make sense for my personality. I don't really feel it makes sense to my business. And so for Instagram, right now, I'm posting our weekly podcast episodes on there, kind of the graphic with the guest or the graphic with the topic of the episode. And those posts do not do that well. Why? Because it's not really made for Instagram. Instagram prefers just photos, like a photo of a sunset, or really they prefer photo of people. So like if you're on vacation, back in the day when we used to go on more vacations, but Instagram's algorithms are looking for certain things. They know what faces are, they know what kind of backgrounds are. So they're going to prioritize those in the algorithm to show to more people versus showing a graphic with a lot of text on it, which is what our podcast graphics tend to look like. And so I know that I'm not utilizing Instagram as a medium as effectively as I could. And we're going to talk more about social media in a subsequent episode of this series. And so I just want you to think about with the social media algorithms and the different mediums that are you using it the way that they are intended and the way that that medium kind of is directing you to do so? Now, Marshall McLuhan looked at large-scale societal changes that resulted from these different technologies, these new technologies like the printing press, radio, television, and so on. So I'm going to take this idea of the medium is the message, and I'm going to apply it to what we do as entrepreneurs, marketers, and content creators so that we can make the most of these platforms and the mediums that we choose to focus on. And really focus is key, as is knowing the goals that we have for each of those platforms. Be sure to stay until the end of this episode because I'm going to give you the details on a special giveaway we're running. We've never done this before. During this series, we're doing this giveaway where you can enter to win a 60-minute coaching session with us. This is extremely valuable, and so make sure to stay until the end. I'll give you more details and the link to go to where you can enter. So as I mentioned, I'm starting this series on the medium is the message, talking about podcasting. Since this is episode number 250, which is a nice number to celebrate and reflect on. And we have nearly 300,000 downloads of the Speaking Your Brand podcast. So other episodes in this series will focus on other mediums like public speaking, video, television, social media, email, and other forms of writing like books and articles. If you're new to Speaking Your Brand, welcome. I am so glad that you're here. Our mission is to help more women entrepreneurs break out of the expert trap and become thought leaders and sought after paid speakers. And these different channels that we're going to be focusing on are the ways that you can put yourself out there, especially your thought leadership, so that more people can learn about you. Now, let's get on with the show. Let's think about first the medium of podcasting. And obviously you're a podcast listener. If you're listening to this podcast, you most likely listen to other podcasts as well. And if you're a host of a podcast or thinking about launching your own podcast, think about these things as well. As a medium, podcasting is very intimate. As the listener, you feel like you know the host. I've been listening to podcasts for a long time, and when I start listening to someone's podcast and I listen for a while, I really do feel like I know the person. You may experience the same thing if you're a listener or if you're a host, where you meet someone at a conference or maybe you even just meet them somewhere online and you really feel like you know the person. And I believe this is because intimacy is created from both frequency and proximity. So we have proximity in the sense because as the listener, you're most likely listening to the podcast in your ear. So in your earbuds. You may also listen in your car, but it's even a car, it's kind of like a bubble. Like you're in this little cocoon, whether it's your earbuds or in your car. And so you have that proximity to the host, and to the guest that they're talking to. So you feel close to them. And then you also have frequency. Most podcasts are aired either weekly or bi-weekly. Some of them are daily or every weekday for the big shows, like the new shows, but for the most part, they're weekly or bi-weekly. And this is why having a regular schedule is so important, because your listeners come to rely on this frequency. That's why every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern time, the Speaking Your Brand podcast drops. And we have been doing that consistently since February 2017. And really, audio only, which is what a podcast has traditionally been, audio only is different from video. It's a different medium because your eyes, you're not looking at anything at the same time. You really are very focused on listening to the host and then at the guest if they have one. And here's the other thing about the medium of podcasting. Unlike TV, there are no gatekeepers and there are no constraints. Really, podcasting was born from talk radio and from satellite radio. So I remember back in the 2000s when I got a new car at the time, this was probably, 2004, 2005, Sirius satellite radio was kind of pre-installed in the car and they gave you a free subscription for a number of months or a year. And I would listen to it and I would listen to some talk radio shows that I like, some progressive talk show host. And I remember Howard Stern famously had gone over to satellite radio from traditional talk radio, from traditional FM, because he wanted to use curse words and talk, say things that he couldn't say because of FCC regulations on regular talk radio. So he went to satellite radio. So really, podcasting was born from talk radio and satellite radio. And what did those formats look like? Well, a lot of times they were just interviews. So long, rambling interviews where they would start on a certain topic with their guest and then just go off on tangents and just kind of like have a conversation, just like you would do with your friends. And so as the listener, you felt like you were listening to friends, especially as you listened week in and week out, and you really got to know them. You just feel like you're part of that inner circle. The other thing with talk radio, satellite radio, and then podcasting was that it was opinionated. So the host had opinions and they shared opinions. And this is one of the things about thought leadership is that as a thought leader, you have to be willing to share opinions. Now, I think they should still be educated opinions, probably just not like randomly saying things that you don't know if true or not or have any basis in reality or fact, but you still should be willing to share opinions. And doing so by creating episodes, and if you're guesting on other people's podcasts, by sharing things and talking about things that are your unique perspective, maybe are counterintuitive, maybe are things that your industry or society hasn't thought about before. Now, contrast talk radio, satellite radio, podcasting with TV and cable news. TV and cable news, they're very short interviews. They're packaged segments. They have a very defined start and end time. So cable news program starts at 1 p.m. and then ends at 1:30 or ends at 2 p.m. And they know that they have short interviews block. So maybe 3 minutes, 5 minutes per interview for that guest. They kind of keep things moving quickly. They do commercials in between. They have these package segments that they come back to every single day. So they know that they have this set format. Whereas satellite radio really didn't have that. It was really just these long interviews and that are kind of just rambled on. And same with podcasting. There's no defined start or end time. You don't have to start at, minute 0 and then end exactly 20 minutes later or end exactly 7 minutes later. You can do whatever you want to, which is really why I love the medium of podcasting. During election seasons, I serve as a Democratic political analyst on the local TV news in Orlando, Florida, where I live. And I've been doing this since 2005, so over 15 years. And I've done this many, many, many times. And when we go on, we literally have 3 minutes between myself, my Republican counterpart, and the anchor or the reporter who's interviewing us. We maybe have 3 minutes, 4 minutes tops to talk about whatever the topic is. That's not a lot of time with 3 people. This is why I love podcasting, because we get to get into things in a deeper way. We get to go long form. So a lot of times people who are starting podcasts ask, well, how long should my episodes be? And I say it doesn't really matter. Do what feels like the right amount of time based on the topic that you're covering and based on the conversation that you're having. When I interview someone, for the most part, those episodes go between 30 to 45 minutes. Sometimes they'll reach close to an hour, but for the most part, 30 to 40 minutes. That seems to be the sweet spot of where I'm able to get enough out of the conversation to make it feel valuable. For solo episodes like the one I'm doing here today, those will maybe run 20 to 30 minutes. Again, it feels kind of like the right amount of time. That being said, I regularly listen to podcast conversations that are more than an hour, that are 90 minutes, even sometimes close to 2 hours. I know a lot of people say, well, you should do podcasts that are 20 minutes because they fit into people's commute. Well, number one, COVID changed all that as far as commuting. But number two, if you're creating great content, in my mind, it doesn't really matter how long it is. Now, that being said, different mediums dictate kind of different lengths of time. Well, that's why we're doing this series. But for podcasting, if you're having a great conversation with someone who is really sharing insightful information and helping the audience think deeper, and you want to go 60 minutes for the interview, then go for it. Now, you should have obviously look at your analytics and see what your audience is interested in and how long they listen and where they drop off. But really do what seems right and seems fitting for that particular topic in that conversation. The other thing that distinguishes podcasts from other types of media is that we generally listen to podcasts while doing something else. Think about if you are watching a video or you're watching a TV show or you're watching a movie, most likely you're not doing something else. I mean, you may glance at your phone or scroll through Instagram, but you're probably not doing something else at the same time. With podcasts, a lot of times I'm cooking, I'm cleaning, I'm driving, and so I'm definitely doing other things. And this is something to keep in mind, is that I'm not really sure that training topics work well as podcast episodes. The reason is because if I'm listening to something that's a training, I want to take notes and I want to write things down. And it's really hard to do so if you're listening to a podcast and doing something else at the same time. Training topics might work better as YouTube videos and really as a course or something on your website that your audience can go through. This is why interview conversations work really well as podcasts, because again, you're kind of listening in, like you're like a fly on the wall, listening in to those people have this conversation. It makes you feel kind of like part of this inner circle. Storytelling is also really big for podcasts. Think about NPR, This American Life, the other NPR style podcasts that are out there where they have like the music and the sound effects and they do a lot of editing. Those are amazing. I would love to do them, but obviously they require a lot of time and an effort to do those. And then you think about a podcast like Serial, which was about the crime that had happened. And I think Serial debuted in 2016. And that's really where podcasting took off in the mainstream, is because it was entertaining. It was story driven. It was like kind of like watching like a little mini movie, except you could just listen to it on a podcast. So I think about podcasts as far as the listeners, either the listeners of this podcast or me as a listener to other podcasts, is that I want to learn something. We want to learn something, but maybe not in a training sense. Maybe we want to learn something in the sense of thinking deeper or thinking differently about a topic, rather than it being procedural, like do these 3 steps to accomplish X, Y, Z. So keep that in mind. So that's the medium of podcasting. The medium of podcasting is intimate because it's audio only and it's in your earbuds. There's no gatekeepers, there's no constraints. It really came from talk radio, satellite radio. So interviews, opinionated, kind of long interviews, like you're listening to friends have a conversation, is where it came from. And thinking about also storytelling and getting your audience to think deeper or think differently about a topic. So that's the medium. Now, the message for the medium of podcasting, the message that gets conveyed. Now, I'm not talking about the specific content, like whether it's a training content or it's a conversation with a client or a conversation with an expert. Talking about the message, and this is really what Marshall McLuhan was getting at, is that the message for the medium of podcasting is, as a listener, you're part of our group, our circle of friends. You're part of our community as Speaking Your Brand. You're part of my life as the host. And as the host, I think about you as the listener, and I seek to build a relationship of trust with you over time. I have so many women who contact me, who schedule consult calls, and they said they found the podcast, they started listening, they binged, like they listened to a bunch of episodes, and then they reached out because they felt like they got to know me enough where that trust was built, and then they wanted to take the next step to work together. So that's the message for the medium of podcasting, is that you're part of our community, you're part of this close-knit group. So here's what I've learned after hosting, creating, interviewing people, 250 episodes in, is that I have found that I really enjoy talking about what I'm excited about, what interests me, what's going to help you to think differently, and what you're interested in as the listener. And so there's like a Venn diagram there of what's interests me, what interests you, and what's going to help you to think differently. I really feel like all three of those need to get met. And doing solo episodes help me to develop my own thought leadership. This is why when we work with our clients in our Thought Leader Academy, one of the things that they do in the very beginning is they decide what they want their thought leadership container or their thought leadership project to be. And some of them want to launch a podcast. And so I encourage them to not only interview other people, but to do their own solo episodes, because that's how they can put their own thought leadership out there. And I'm thinking about the episode that we did back in March of 2020 on choosing women's voices. So auditing what the books that you're reading, the podcasts that you're listening to, the TV and movies that you watch, and making sure that there's a preponderance of women's voices in there. And then more recently, in the past couple of months, I've been talking about this idea of the expert trap and how you want to evolve from being an expert to a thought leader. So these solo episodes have helped me to develop my own thought leadership, and they can do the same for you. I've also found that I really enjoy interviewing our clients and women in our community. I get pitches every single day from people who want to be on the Speaking Your Brand podcast, and I don't know who they are. Sometimes they write on their behalf. Sometimes it's a podcast booking agency pitching them. And if I don't know them and they don't really have not made a connection with me, they haven't reached out prior on social media, or somehow I really, frankly, just delete those pitches because they're not that interesting to me. Our clients are incredibly fascinating to me, and I want to showcase them and give them exposure and give them visibility on the podcast. And so I really try to bring them on, as you've noticed. And then if I'm looking for a subject matter expert, then I look for women who are in our community. So women who have reached out to us prior, who've engaged with us on social media, who have written in that they're a podcast listener. I'm really looking for them and to bring them on to the podcast, because it makes the interview process so much more enjoyable for me. What I've known about podcasting since the very beginning, when I started this in early 2017, and this is still true today, is that podcasting is a long game. It takes time to build an audience. It takes time to build that relationship of trust with your audience. And it just takes time to kind of get your podcast out there, get your episodes out there, and get the different platforms and the Google search and things to be able to find your content. I remember when I first decided to do a podcast in late 2016, I decided that I was going to do it for a minimum of 1 year. I was making that commitment to myself that no matter what the download numbers were, I was going to do it for 1 year because I knew it wasn't going to have instantaneous results. And I'm so glad that I did that. And at this point, we are now, well over 4.5 years in, and I have no intentions of stopping the podcast. Like I said earlier, I really identify as a podcaster as much as an entrepreneur. And the podcast has been our best client attractor. And this is why I love doing the podcast, and I love thinking about what excites me, what interests you, and what's going to help you to think differently, because I believe that's what attracts amazing women to work with us. And so here's how I think about doing that is obviously in these episodes and in the clients that we bring on is to share our values, our approach, how we work, kind of how I think, how I see the world, and the kind of women that we work with, so that you hear me and you hear them and you think, oh, they have the same goals that I have. They have the same values that I have. They are on a similar journey. I want to join Carol and Diane, and I want to join these other women too. The other thing that I do as far as attracting listeners is when I create the titles for the podcast episode. Now, this is like very granular. When I create the titles, I try to include keywords that I think people would search on when searching for particular topics. So I don't try to be too cutesy with the titles. I really try to make sure I'm putting common keywords in there, because a lot of times potential clients, when they reach out, I ask them, how did you hear about Speaking Your Brand? And they will say that they did a search. So a search in Spotify, a search in Apple Podcasts to find the podcast, or they just did a Google search and they found the Speaking Your Brand website. But I love that so many of our clients come from the Speaking Your Brand podcast, because it really helps them to know upfront, even before they start working with us, what it's going to be like. The other thing that I've learned after doing 250 episodes and after listening to so many podcasts now over the past 12 years is that audio quality is really, really important. And a lot of times I see entrepreneurs launch podcasts and they don't take it very seriously how important audio quality is. And if I start listening and the quality is not good, I'm going to stop listening and listen to something else, because it's such an intimate medium and it's in your ears or in your car. You really need to focus on audio quality. And I have to give a shout out and many, many thanks to my podcast editor, Tim Wolberg, for being such a fantastic editor. We have been working together on this podcast since March of 2018, so well over 3.5 years. And he makes his podcast sound great every single week. And anytime it doesn't sound great, that is totally on me, not on him. It's because the room that I was in wasn't sounding good, or there was external noise that I couldn't control, or the guests didn't have the right equipment. Whatever it is totally on me, not on him. He is incredible. You can find him at podcastperformancecoach.com. Again, podcastperformancecoach.com. He has his own podcast as well, all about podcasting. It's called Just One Tip. So you can look it up there. We've had a few clients who've come through the Thought Leader Academy and have worked with us who have ended up working with Tim to shape their podcast launches. So he's fantastic. Those are the lessons that I've learned after these 250 episodes. So here's what I would like to think about for the future of this podcast. I would love to do more storytelling type episodes. I mentioned why Serial and these crime podcasts are so popular is because of the storytelling. So I would love to find a way to do more storytelling within the podcast. And then also I am starting to work on my book around this idea of the expert trap. So I'm really going to use this podcast to explore these book ideas as I start thinking about them and writing drafts of them. I want to get it out to you. I want to see what resonates with you. So I'm going to be exploring those book ideas here on the podcast. A couple of things as we wrap up. I'm going to tell you about that special giveaway in just a moment, but I would love for you to help me celebrate 250 episodes by sharing one of your favorite episodes on social media, in your email newsletter, and with a friend. So if you want to do all three of those, that would be fantastic. So share on Instagram or LinkedIn. You can tag me. You can find the links to my social media accounts in the show notes for this episode, which is at speakingyourbrand.com/250. You can also share a favorite episode in your email newsletter. I want to say thank you to Susan M. And she knows who she is. She is a loyal listener and she often shares her favorite episodes in her email newsletter to her list. So I'm so grateful for Susan. And you can also share with a friend or a colleague a favorite episode that you think would be beneficial to them, because this is the way that the podcast grows. Now, here's that special giveaway that we're running during the series that I'm calling The Medium is the Message, is that you can enter to win a 60-minute coaching session with us. It's entirely free to enter, no purchase necessary. Go to speakingyourbrand.com/win, W-I-N. Yeah, very simple. Speakingyourbrand.com/win. We'll be randomly pulling names throughout the series, so don't wait until the series is over. Do it now. And so go ahead and just right now you can click pause on your phone. If you're listening on your phone, click pause, go open your browser, go to speakingyourbrand.com/win, just enter your name and email, and you'll be entered to win. Now, this 60-minute coaching session is truly a coaching session. It's not like a disguise as a sales pitch. We're not going to use the time to pitch you something. You can use this coaching session to review a presentation you already have. So if you have an outline and a slide deck for a presentation that you're giving and you want us to review it, you can use that. And that would be helpful, whether it's a lead generation presentation, could be virtual or in person, maybe it's a keynote presentation that you're doing, you can use that. You could also use the session to map out a strategy for your speaking and visibility for next year. So that could be super helpful. You can use a session to work on your speaking proposals, your speaking fees, your speaking packages. It's truly up to you what you think you you need right now and that you could use that time for. Again, it's free to enter, no purchase necessary. Go to speakingyourbrand.com/win. Until next time, thanks for listening.